Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to this short session for half an hour. And I want to talk about hybrid working. Tim Baker's my name, and I want to talk about, what we've been through over the last couple of years in relation to our working conditions. Of course, many people had no choice but to work remotely. But of course, other people did. And of course, a lot of office workers worked remotely. And I guess my point about that is it's likely to continue. It's unlikely that we're going back to a situation pre-COVID. I think that it makes a lot of sense that hybrid working continues, and I don't doubt for a minute that it will. There's been a strong move towards remote working over the last 2 decades, in fact, but often it was seen as a privilege previously. And then, of course, when COVID hit, it was a necessity. But I think what's going to happen now and is happening is that people will continue in some way, shape or form to work remotely, not for all of their time, but for a significant portion of their time. Now, of course, what that does is it creates really interesting issues for HR, because if people are working remotely more often, then there's going to be communication issues that need to be addressed and many other issues as well. And what I'd like to do is just talk about some of those today and just perhaps alert you to some of those issues. So let me share my slides and then we can launch into the presentation. All right, so first of all, for those of you who don't know who I am, just to give you a quick overview, Tim Baker, I'm obviously an author, and one of my books coming out in late May, June is the future of human resources, unlocking human potential. And so I'm going to share with you some of my thoughts from that book today. There's other books I've written, of course. I also am a keynote speaker, an executive coach. I run workshops for groups of people. And of course, you can see up in the top right-hand corner, I still play rugby in the Golden Oldies competition here in Brisbane, which at my age is a little tragic, I guess, but it's more of a social thing than anything else. All right, now one of the primary objections people would have to this question of remote working, or perhaps what I might call as hybrid working, is this. Many HR are thinking about this. Is it worth putting the infrastructure in for remote working when we're going to come out of this pandemic? The answer to that question is yes. And the reason for that is very simply that we're never going back to the way we were pre-COVID. It's likely now, with greater flexibility, that people will want to spend time working from home, if they've got the luxury to do that. Now, why would that be the case? Well, first of all, people are a little bit more used to it, so that makes a difference. And secondly, if you look at one of the biggest things that people want from their work in this day and age, it's work-life balance. People, of course, are juggling balls in the air and they want to be able to create that. So I think those issues are going to mean that hybrid working is going to be here to stay. Not to mention the fact, of course, of costs of doing business. It's often more cost effective for people to be working at home at different points, not just because they can concentrate on completing their reports or whatever, but also because they're not putting costs on perhaps office costs and so on. So I think you'll find that this is here to stay, very much so. All right, so what I want to do in our short session is, first of all, I want to address a very interesting topic, and that is, does productivity increase when people are working from home? That's an interesting question, and I want to put two sides to the story. There's no conclusive evidence one way or the other, but I think if you read media reports, you get the idea that people are either wildly productive at home or very frustrated, nothing in between. So I'm going to talk about some of the challenges of remote working and what those challenges might entail for HR. And at the end of this presentation, I've got a special offer for you for being in this presentation. Right, so as I mentioned earlier, I believe that remote working in some way, shape or form is here to stay. And I think that it's going to be something that will continue in the future. Now, the question then is, of course, if we're talking about office-based workers, when's the best time to be working from home and when's the best time to be working in the office? I think the best time to be working at home is when you've got what Carl Newport calls deep work to do. Deep work is where you can't be distracted. You need to concentrate on what you're doing. And as a result of that, the best place to do that potentially is at home. But on the other hand, of course, people have got to collaborate. There's got to be project meetings. There's got to be opportunities to discuss certain tasks and activities. Well, of course, the best place to do that is in the office. So what I think we're going to find is a demarcation between those things that we do at home and those things that we do in the office. And so when people are wanting to work from home, they will justify it on the basis that they need to focus, for hours to complete a report or something along those lines. But obviously there's still going to be opportunities and still should be opportunities for people to work in the office where they come together and congregate around a table and perhaps meet on certain issues. So I have no doubt about that. And I think what we've got to do is we've got to prepare ourselves for that environment. And I think from what I can pick up, HR is a little slow on this whole approach. In fact, in many respects, HR is asking itself the question, what can I do to try to get people to come back to work? And I think a better question than that is, why don't they want to come back to work? Might be a more interesting question for human resources to answer. So let's have a look at some interesting statistics and key points around the whole notion of productivity working from home. So it is a valid question if we're going to talk about hybrid working. And the valid question is, are people actually really more productive at home than in the office? So let's have a look at this. Certainly anecdotally, many managers I spoke to in 2020, that was of course the time when people really had to work from home. And I spoke to many managers after several months when they were working from home. And they told me that they were pleasantly surprised by how well employees adapted to working from home or working remotely. And I was surprised that they were surprised, because the assumption was, unless I'm there leading and supervising, people are not going to get on and do the job, which I knew wasn't the case. So people adapted well, and people dug in, they did what they needed to do, and they got a lot of good work done during 2020 and 2021 as well, and perhaps even now. So there is some research that backs this up, and there is some research that does suggest that people's productivity actually goes up when they're working from home. And I guess if you think about it, for a starter, there's no water cooler at home. There's no organizational politics at home. There's no commute time. So automatically you've got those things which are very time consuming that are basically off the list. And a more recent US-based study showed that 35% increase in employee productivity when people work from home. I guess it very much depends on the industry and what sort of industry people work in as to whether or not their productivity would increase working from home. So we have to be very cautious not to just make the assumption that people's productivity goes up when they work from home. I think there are other factors involved in this as well. So, as I said earlier, there is a question now around about how do we get our employees back into the office? And that seems to be a challenge for a lot of businesses. But as I said earlier, I think a far better question to ask would be, why don't they want to come back to the workplace? And I think some people, of course, have got comfortable working from home. And the reality is they can juggle that work-life balance that they couldn't do, of course, working in the office. Now, not everybody is thrilled about working from home, of course, because there is a little bit of isolation that goes on working from home. And of course, people can get lonely and want to have that, regular contact with their colleagues at work. The corridor conversation's gone. The water cooler conversation's gone. Talking with people in the kitchen is gone. So I'm not sure that everybody enjoys working from home. Certainly, I'm perfectly comfortable with it. But I guess it depends very much, one, on the person itself, and also, of course, the work that they have to do. And when you factor those two issues into consideration, then you can probably determine whether or not productivity goes up. Now, there is a concept called panic productivity. Now, panic productivity is an interesting concept. And there is a theory that one of the reasons that people's productivity might have gone up working from home during the pandemic was the fact that people were panicking about their job. Of course, people were feeling vulnerable in 2020 about whether or not they'd still have a job. And it may well have been that that was a sort of a negative motivation to get them to produce more, because they were panicking that perhaps they might lose their job as a result of working from home, and the fact that they were out of sight, out of mind. And I think there's some validity to that. And we don't hear much about that in the media. So I think it's very possible that panic productivity could be a very real issue. Now, productivity, let's just define what we mean by productivity, because the word productivity itself needs to be unpacked somewhat. Productivity is normally measured by how much one gets done in a defined period of time. So, for example, if person A can produce 3 things in an hour versus person B who can produce 1 thing, you could argue that person A is more productive, assuming, of course, it's the same thing that they're doing, and we can measure it across that. So productivity is really about getting more done in the time frame. Now, I think it's fairly true that if we're measuring people on the basis of productivity, it's very true that people working from home could well be more productive because there's flexible hours. In other words, when you're working from home, it's sort of rigid, isn't it? You're expected to be at work at a certain time. You're expected to finish at a certain time. People have a lunch break. People have, usually a morning or an afternoon break. So work in the office is far more regimented than it is working from home. But of course, in the situation of working from home, you can work, late at night. You can work early in the morning. You can do a little bit of this and a little bit of that. You can fluctuate from one activity to the next. So when we consider this productivity question, we have to also factor take into account that people are a little bit more flexible in how they go about what they do when they're working from home. Now, does that actually mean they're more productive, or could it mean that they're just spending longer getting what they would do in the workplace done? It could mean the latter. And so we need to be very cautious about this notion that people's productivity rises when people work from home. It's not necessarily the case, although I would certainly say that in my case it does. Maybe it does in yours. But I guess, as I said earlier, it depends on the work. It also depends on the person and their personality. And it also depends on the notion of what we're measuring here. Are we measuring productivity? Are we measuring effectiveness? Are we measuring efficiency? So what are we actually measuring here? But if it's productivity, maybe it can be a bit misleading. Now, one of the big challenges, of course, working from home and remote working that needs to be addressed, and I'll talk about this a bit further in a moment, is the whole concept of communicating with people at a distance. This is obviously challenging. I mean, we're used to now having numerous Zoom calls, and we're having meetings virtually back to back on Zoom from home. Some people would argue that this is not as effective as it would be face to face. Some people have what might be called Zoom fatigue. So the communication issue is very, very interesting, and we're not too sure yet, it's early days, whether in fact that's actually making, whether that's making a difference. Now, when we look at the concept of hybrid working, and when we look at the notion of working from home, we should take into account that when this is what we might call the employee life cycle that I've got in my book. And if you think about it, these 5 stages are pretty constant regardless of what the industry is, and they're likely to stay constant in the future. So the first step in the employee life cycle, of course, is to be recruited and selected. And, people apply for a job, they get an interview, and if they're successful in the interview and their referee checks check out, they may be offered the job to fill a vacancy. Now, think about this from the perspective of remote working. So in a remote working environment, what this means, of course, is that we're now going to be recruiting and selecting people who we may not even meet. So these are people who we still may do a Zoom interview with them, but we physically are not even going to meet, which in itself can be interesting. And so, we've got some challenges around that need to be addressed around recruitment and selection. And last week, I talked about recruiting and selecting on the basis of potential rather than past experience. And that, of course, can become a little bit more challenging when you're having an interview online. And then, of course, probably more challenging is that once the person has been selected for the job, they've signed the contract, they've worked the date out when they're going to start, they need to be inducted. And so again, with hybrid working arrangements, there is going to be some challenges in the future around how we induct people who aren't physically on site. So that's going to be a communication issue. So obviously the answer to that is not sending someone long-winded emails with numerous bullet points. All that's going to do is frustrate people. So we've got to work out how we're going to communicate with people if we're going to induct them remotely. Now, of course, not everyone will be inducted remotely and won't be, but there may well be occasions where that needs to be considered. And HR's got to grapple with how they're going to change their induction process to suit that. Now, training and development, of course, is another phase that people go through in their employee life cycle. So again, you may not be sitting in a classroom with a trainer out the front and a group of people sitting beside you. So what's the future hold with hybrid working, where people are actually getting their training and development needs met remotely? Now, lots of organizations are adjusting to that. And of course, there's a whole lot of virtual training that people can do. But is that as effective as it would be in a classroom arrangement? Probably early days. Of course, many people enjoy the interaction with their fellow participants during training, and they can learn a lot. And that is somewhat stifled working from home. Of course, you can still have breakout rooms and all the rest via Zoom, but that's another challenge that HR has got to look at. Another challenge is, how do we reward and promote people when they're working remotely? Another challenge, because they're not there in the office perhaps as much as they would normally be, or perhaps they're not there at all. So we have to consider how we're going to reward people and how we're going to promote people. And of course, exit interviews. Well, exit interviews are normally done face to face. And these are usually the last interview that a person does before they leave. And before they leave, they usually are a little bit more open and honest with whoever it is that is conducting the interview, somebody usually in HR. And so the idea of that, of course, is that HR can glean a whole lot of useful information for their own, for their own planning for the future. But of course, if people are working remotely or in a hybrid format, many of these exit interviews are going to have to be conducted online. Is that going to be as effective as it would be if we had them, in the room? So you can see there are a lot of challenges there that HR has to grapple with in relation to hybrid working. And as I said earlier, hybrid working's here to stay. So the pressure's on for HR to get a number of processes in place to make that work. Now, here are a couple of other challenges we should have a look at. And I think that I'd like to focus on these before we finish up today. One of the challenges is that the concept of management and leadership has to change. Well, we've been saying that, of course, for the last 2 decades in a general sense. But of course, if you're managing or leading somebody remotely, then that's often got that's got a whole different emphasis, hasn't it, than if they're just down the corridor where we can stroll up to them and say hello and talk to them about the work that they're doing. It's not that we're not necessarily going to have that luxury in the future. So we're going to have to trust our employees more. We're going to have to allow them to show greater degrees of autonomy, to be able to exercise their independent judgment, prudently, of course, in the right place at the right time. And that's going to really challenge some of the traditional notions around what leading people is all about. The other challenge, of course, and I've alluded to this earlier, is that we've got the concept of cultural isolation. So the question is, if we've got people working remotely, or at least not in the office as often as they would be, two things there. How do we manage the loneliness and isolation that goes with that? And do we actually even have a role in doing that? And secondly, what does it say about workplace culture? So we know that workplace culture is a vogue topic for a number of years now. So how are we going to create a great culture when we've got people who are basically working from home? That becomes an interesting challenge that HR has to grapple with. Of course, as I mentioned earlier, how do we communicate with people? Ultimately, sending people twice as many emails is not going to be the answer. We know that for sure. So we've got some fundamental challenges to think about there in terms of communication. Do we need to increase our number of Zoom meetings? How do we give feedback to employees when they're not down the corridor? So what we actually see is the end result of what people do, but we don't necessarily see how they go about doing it. So how do we actually give feedback to people on that basis? And of course, for managers to develop rapport and trust with their team members, that's going to be a bit more challenging in a hybrid working environment, because obviously people aren't there all the time, if at all. So now we're in a position where, how do we develop trust and rapport? How do we do it quickly and effectively so that trust levels have increased, engagement levels have increased, and so forth? So there's a couple of challenges. Now, every Friday I have one of these sessions, and I would invite you to come along to next Friday. And next Friday, I'm going to talk about converting job descriptions into role descriptions. Now, you might say, isn't that just semantics? But it's not. A job description has been around for about 100 years. We all have a little bit of a laugh and chuckle about the inadequacies of the job description. And I think its time has passed. I think we really need to move towards a role description to capture the number of roles that people play at work. Now, one of the roles that people play at work is obviously their job role. But there are other roles that people play at work, and we need to understand what they are. So join me next Friday on the 25th at 10 a.m. That's Australian Eastern Standard Time. And you can see on your screen there's a link. So just as you did today, if you click on that link, that'll take you in and you'll be able to register. All right. And the other thing I'd like to say before we wrap up is that my book, as I mentioned earlier, The Future of Human Resources, Unlocking Human Potential, will be out in a matter of months. And what I'd like to do is to offer you a special deal. If you go to Amazon, even though it's just posted there, you can't purchase it yet, you're looking at a recommended retail price of around $46 plus postage. So if you'd like to send me an email today, and there's my email address, I will be prepared to sign and send you the book as soon as it's out, hot off the press, for half that price plus postage. So all you have to do is send me an email today and I'll put you on a list. I'll be in contact with you and you can purchase a copy of that book at half the price. So folks, that's it from me. Let me just stop sharing for a moment. So thank you for joining me today. I hope that's given you food for thought on some of the issues around hybrid working and what needs to happen as a result of that. So I look forward to seeing you next week when we broach that subject of job descriptions and how we can turn those into role descriptions. So thanks everyone. Have a wonderful weekend and let's hope to see you next Friday for an interesting discussion. Have a great weekend. Thank you and goodbye.